The wheat was the first thing to lie to us. I remember standing on the edge of Sector 9 looking out over that golden ocean, thinking about how beautiful it was. It stretched all the way to the horizon, a sea of amber grain that was supposed to feed 1 billion mouths in the hive cities uptown. It looked healthy. It looked strong. But if you knelt down, if you actually touched the earth like I did every morning, you could feel the truth waiting there. The soil was too dry. Not the dryness of a drought, but something else. It felt hollow. It felt like the nutrients had been sucked out from below, leaving only dust and structure behind. I wiped the grit from my fingers and told myself it was just a sensor malfunction. I told myself the irrigation pumps were just clogged again. You do that, don't you? You tell yourself the small lie, so you don't have to face the big truth. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and looked at the sky. It was a perfect cloudless blue. I didn't know then that a clear sky is just an open mouth waiting to close. The routine was my anchor. Wake up at 500, check the pressure valves on the hydroponic feeds, mix the nutrient slurry. It was a rhythmic, mechanical existence that I had grown to love because it was predictable. Aegis 4 was a boring planet, and I liked it that way. I liked that my biggest problem was usually a rusted coupling or a jammed harvester. That morning, the machinery was humming its usual low, vibrating song. It was a comfort. The thrum of the atmospheric processors usually drowned out everything else, a white noise that let you forget how far away from civilization we really were. But that day, the hum seemed thinner. Beneath the mechanical noise, there was a silence that didn't belong. It was a heavy, suffocating absence of sound. I stopped tuning a valve and just listened. No insects. Usually the fields are alive with the buzzing of pollinators, the genetically modified beetles we imported to maintain the crop cycles. There was nothing, just the wind hissing through the dry stalks. I went back to the maintenance shed to check the logs. My hands were shaking just a little. I blamed it on too much recaf. The data slate showed a gradual decline in biomass readings across the entire sector over the last week. 0.05%, then 0.1, then 0.3. It wasn't a cliff, it was a slope, a slow sliding descent into sterility. I tapped the screen trying to reset the calibration. Glitch, I muttered. I said it aloud to make it real, just a sensor ghost. I needed to believe that because the alternative was that the planet was dying, and if the planet was dying, then Lena and I had nowhere to go. We were contracted labor. We didn't have tickets off-world. We didn't even have access to the priority Vox channels. We were part of the machinery, and you don't save the gears when the engine catches fire. You just let them burn. Lena was waiting for me by the perimeter fence when I finished my shift. She didn't wave. She never did. She just stood there, watching the grain sway her small hands, gripping the chain link so hard her knuckles were white. She's mute, has been since the accident in the manufactorum when we were kids. But she hears things I miss. She feels the world in a way that terrifies me. When I approached her, she didn't look at me. She was staring at a patch of tall grass near the irrigation ditch. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something invisible. I put a hand on her shoulder and she flinched. It wasn't like her. She was usually calm a rock in the stream of my anxiety. "Let's go inside, Lena," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The wind smells wrong today." It did. It smelled like copper and ozone, like a storm was coming. But the weather radar was completely clear. We walked back to the HAB unit in silence. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Usually, this was the time of day when the gloombirds would start their calls, a haunting melodic trill that signaled the end of the shift. I waited for it. I strained my ears against the wind, begging for just one bird to sing. But the silence held. It was absolute. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I looked at the neighbors' houses as we passed. Windows were dark or shuttered. People were inside. I wondered if they felt it too, this creeping pressure. I wondered if they were huddled around their dinner tables, trying to ignore the fact that the world outside had stopped making sense. I wanted to knock on a door, grab someone by the collar and scream, "Do you hear that silence?" But I didn't. I just held Lena's hand tighter and walked faster. Inside our unit, the air was stale. The recyclers were working overtime, but they couldn't scrub the metallic taste from the air. I went to the Voxcaster in the corner, the old unit I'd scavenged from a scrap heap. I wanted to hear a voice from the capital. Just a weather report, a traffic update, anything to prove that society still existed. I turned the dial. Static. Not the usual crackle of atmospheric interference, but a thick, wet static. It sounded like meat being ground up. It sounded like a billion voices screaming from the bottom of a well. I turned it off quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at Lena. She was sitting at the table, drawing circles on the metal surface with her finger. She hadn't taken off her coat. She knew. She didn't know what it was, but she knew we weren't safe. "It's just solar flares," I told her. I was lying to a mute girl who couldn't call me out on it, and I felt like a coward. Interferes with the long-range comms. Happens every few years. I went to the kitchen to prepare rations. Opening the packet, the smell of processed starch made my stomach turn. I wasn't hungry. I forced myself to eat, forced myself to perform the pantomime of normalcy. I cleaned my tools. I polished my boots. I did everything except look out the window. Because I knew if I looked out, I would see the shadows lengthening in a way that physics couldn't explain. I would see the darkness pooling in the furrows of the fields, moving when the wind wasn't blowing. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. The silence was louder than any siren. I got up and grabbed my heavy torch, the industrial kind we use for inspecting the deep wells. I told myself I just needed to check the perimeter sensors one more time, just to be sure. I stepped out into the night. It was cold, colder than it should have been for this season. The moisture seemed to have been stripped from the air. I walked toward the edge of the field, where the automated threshers were parked for the night. The beam of my torch cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the air, unmoving. That's when I saw it. It was lying near the base of the water tower. A grox, one of the heavy reptilian livestock beasts we used for hauling, was a massive creature, usually weighing a ton of muscle and bad temper. But this was just a husk. It wasn't rotting. There were no flies. There was no smell of decay. It looked like it had been freeze-dried. The skin was pulled tight over the bones, gray and papery. I knelt beside it, the beam of my light shaking in my hand. There was no blood, no wound that I could see. It was as if the fluid inside it had simply evaporated or been drawn out through the pores. I touched the hide, and it crumbled under my gloved finger like dry leaves. I stood up, backing away. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. I swung the light around, scanning the fields. For a second, just a fraction of a second, I thought I saw movement. Not an animal running, but a shifting of the texture of the dark. Something many-limbed and low to the ground, disappearing into the tall wheat. I didn't chase it. I didn't investigate. The heroic thing would have been to sound the alarm to wake the neighbors. But I am not a hero. I am a brother. I turned and ran back to the hab unit, slamming the heavy steel door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. I slid down against the metal, listening to the blood rushing in my ears. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the gaps in the window frames. It didn't sound like wind anymore. It sounded like hunger. The silence of the soil wasn't peace. It was a dinner plate being cleared. The town was never a place of joy, but it used to be a place of noise. It was a grid of prefab concrete and corrugated steel huddled together against the winds of the plains. Usually, it smelled of recaf engine grease and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. It was the smell of life, however miserable. But that afternoon, when I took Lena into the settlement, the smell had changed. It was sterile. It smelled like antiseptic and old dust. The streets were emptier than they should have been for a shift change. The few people we passed didn't nod. They didn't grumble about the quotas or the weather. They walked with a unified gliding purpose, their eyes fixed on some middle distance that I couldn't see. I pulled Lena closer to me, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. She was trembling a low-frequency vibration that traveled right through her coat into my side. She knew. The town wasn't sleeping. It was waiting. We went to the medical station first. Lena had been coughing a dry hacking sound that rattled in her small chest, and I wanted to believe it was just the dust. I wanted to believe it wasn't the spores I'd seen drifting in the fields. The waiting room was bathed in the harsh, flickering light of a failing lumen strip. It buzzed like a dying insect. There was an old man in the corner, a miner I recognized named Coyle. He used to tell loud, obnoxious jokes about the foreman. Now he sat perfectly still, staring at the blank wall. His skin had a grayish waxen cast to it, like he had been drained of blood and filled with something else. When I said his name, he didn't blink. He just turned his head slowly too smoothly and looked at me with eyes that seemed flat. "Elias," he said. His voice was hollow. "The work is good today." He turned back to the wall. I felt a cold sweat prickle at the base of my spine. Dr. Eris was the only medic for 3 sectors. I had known him for years. He was a tired, cynical man who drank too much Amasec and complained about his pension. But the man who walked into the examination room wasn't the Eris I knew. He looked polished. His bald head, usually shiny with sweat, was dry and pale. His movements were precise, lacking the usual tremor of a hangover. He examined Lena with cold, efficient hands. He didn't ask her how she was feeling. He didn't offer her a sweet stick like he used to. He just pressed the stethoscope to her chest and listened for a long, uncomfortable minute. His eyes, I realized with a jolt of nausea, weren't blinking. The lid stayed retracted, the pupils dilated wide, swallowing the iris. It was like looking into the eyes of a shark. "She is fine," Aris said, pulling the instrument away. His voice was flat, lacking any inflection. "Her lungs are adapting." I stared at him. Adapting to what? She's coughing up black mucus, Aris. That's not adaptation. That's sickness. He smiled then, and it was the worst thing I had seen all day. It didn't reach his eyes. It was just a muscular contraction of the lips exposing teeth that looked slightly too long, slightly too sharp. "It is a new atmosphere, Elias. We must all change to survive it. The Star Children bring gifts of evolution." He handed me a blank data slate, pretending to update her file. I grabbed Lena's hand, my grip tight enough to bruise. "We're leaving," I said. Aris didn't stop us. He just watched us go, that frozen smile still plastered on his face. As we left, I heard him humming a tune that had no melody, just a rhythmic, buzzing drone. We walked back through the residential block as the twin suns began to dip below the horizon. The shadows stretched out long and distorted, grasping at our ankles. I felt eyes on us, not just from the windows, but from the vents, from the alleyways, from the storm drains. I kept looking over my shoulder, catching glimpses of movement, a bald head ducking behind a crate, a limb that bent at the wrong angle disappearing into a doorway. The paranoia was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I remembered the stories the old spacers used to tell about ships found drifting in the void, crews vanished, bulkheads covered in slime. I always thought they were ghost stories. Now I wasn't sure. The town felt like a stage where everyone knew the script except us. We took the shortcut behind the water processing plant. It was a narrow alley filled with rusted pipes and dripping condensation. It was quieter here, away from the main thoroughfare. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A skittering sound, like claws on metal. Fast. Clicking. I spun around, raising my heavy wrench, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I shouted. The sound stopped instantly. There was nothing there but a pile of old shipping pallets and a puddle of oil. But the oil had been disturbed. Someone or something had been painting with it. I stepped closer, keeping Lena behind me. On the corrugated wall of the shed, smeared in thick black engine grease, was a symbol. It wasn't an Imperial eagle. It wasn't a gang tag. It was a spiral, a twisting serpentine shape, with 3 jagged arms radiating outward. It looked like a worm coiling around a star, or a mouth opening to swallow a world. It was wet and glistening. Looking at it made my head ache, a sharp pressure behind the eyes. It felt ancient and hateful. It felt like a promise. "Don't look at it, Lena," I whispered, shielding her eyes. But I couldn't stop looking. It was a mark of ownership. They weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a cult. And we were the sacrifice. I realized then that the silence of the soil in Chapter 1 wasn't death. It was preparation. The planet wasn't dying. It was being marinated. I grabbed Lena and we ran the rest of the way home, the sound of phantom footsteps echoing in the alley behind us, matching our pace step for step until we slammed our door shut. But even inside with the locks engaged, I knew the truth. The locks were meant to keep people out. They wouldn't stop what was coming. The sky didn't darken like a storm. It bruised. That is the only way I can describe it. It turned a sick, mottled purple like old blood trapped under a fingernail. I was up at the old observation deck near the grain silo trying to fix a jammed wind vane that had been screeching for days. I smelled it before I saw it. The air had turned thick and oily, coating the inside of my nose with a film I couldn't sneeze out. It tasted like sulfur and rotten eggs, a stench that coated the back of your throat and made you want to gag. It was the smell of a stagnant swamp, but we were in the middle of a dry dust bowl. I looked up, wiping sweat from my eyes with a rag that was suddenly too gritty. The clouds were churning, boiling in unnatural patterns. They weren't drifting with the wind. They were pulsating, contracting, and expanding like living tissue. And then the first drop hit my cheek. It wasn't water. It was thick, viscous, and warm. I wiped it away and looked at my glove. It was slime. Ichor. The sky wasn't crying. It was drooling. Then the star fell. It broke through the cloud layer with a sound like tearing canvas, a high-pitched scream that vibrated in the fillings of my teeth. It was huge, a burning teardrop wreathed in green fire, trailing smoke that looked like twisting intestines. But it didn't move like a rock. Rocks fall in a straight line, obedient to gravity. This thing, it corrected itself. I saw the retro thrusters fire not mechanical jets, but bursts of gas and fluid expelled from spiracles along its side. It slowed down, hunting for a landing spot. It wasn't crashing, it was docking. It slammed into the earth about 2 kilometers east near the old quarry. The ground jumped under my feet. The shockwave hit me a second later, a wall of hot, stinking air that knocked me flat against the metal grating of the deck. The sirens started then, the old air raid klaxons that hadn't been tested in 50 years. They sounded weak, pathetic against the roaring of the atmosphere, like a dying animal whimpering in a hurricane. I didn't stay to watch. Instinct took over the lizard part of the brain that screams, hide. I scrambled down the ladder, missing rungs, sliding the last 10 feet, and hitting the dirt running. Lena, I screamed her name before I even reached the door. She was standing in the yard, frozen, looking up at the burning trail in the sky, her mouth open in a silent scream. I tackled her, carrying us both through the doorway of the HAB unit. I kicked the door shut and threw the heavy deadbolts, my fingers fumbling with the keys. "Get the tape," I barked at her, my voice cracking. The duct tape. Now, we sealed the windows. We sealed the vents. We sealed the crack under the door. It was a futile gesture, like trying to stop a flood with a spoon, but I needed to do something. I needed to feel like I had control. The air inside the room was getting hot, stifling. The rain outside was intensifying a heavy drumming rhythm on the metal roof. Thud, thud, thud. It was too heavy for rain. These were pods, thousands of them. I peered through the slit in the shutter I'd left open. The impact site at the quarry was glowing with a sickly bioluminescence, lighting up the purple dark. The smoke wasn't gray. It was green spores billowing out like a fog bank rolling toward us. And in that fog, shadows were moving. Not the slow, shambling movement of the neighbors I'd seen earlier. This was fast, jerky, insectoid. I saw shapes leaping over the perimeter fence 10 feet high, topped with razor wire like it was nothing. They moved in a swarm, a carpet of chitin and claws flowing over the land. I saw a guard tower in the distance, flash with las-fire bright red beams cutting the gloom. Then the tower simply collapsed, pulled down by 1,000 clawing hands. The firing stopped. The silence that followed was heavy with chewing sounds. I turned away from the window and slid down the wall. Lena was huddled under the table, her hands over her ears, rocking back and forth. I crawled over to her and pulled her close, smelling the fear on her sharp and acidic. The drumming on the roof was constant now. It sounded like hail, but hail doesn't scratch at the metal. Hail doesn't hiss. I looked at my wrench, the heavy steel comforting in my hand, then at the heavy blast door of the storm cellar in the floor. It was meant for tornadoes, not monsters. Downstairs, I whispered. We go downstairs. The sky belonged to them now. We only had the dirt left. And even the dirt felt like it was betraying us, vibrating with the footsteps of 1 billion hungry things. We didn't leave the cellar because we wanted to. We left because the house above us ceased to exist. It started with a sound like a freight train derailing directly on top of our living room. Wood-splintered metal shrieked, and dust poured down through the floorboards in choking gray waterfalls. I looked up and saw the ceiling buckle, a claw 3 feet long and serrated like a steak knife, punched through the plascrete like it was wet cardboard. It wasn't hunting us specifically. It was just demolishing obstacles. The structural supports groaned and snapped. "Move!" I yelled, dragging Lena up the emergency hatch that led to the backyard. We scrambled out into the night, just as the HAB unit collapsed inward, imploding into a heap of rubble and dust. If we had stayed down there 1 minute longer, we would have been buried alive. The air outside was a firestorm. The sky was lit up by the strobing red beams of lasfire and the sickly green glow of bioplasma. The heat was intense, singing the hair on my arms. The street was a slaughterhouse. The Planetary Defense Force had set up a barricade at the intersection, a wall of sandbags and heavy stubbers. It looked impressive. It lasted about 30 seconds. I watched as a tide of hormagaunts running beasts, all legs and blades, surged over the sandbags like water, breaking a dam. They didn't stop to fight. They just overwhelmed. They buried the soldiers under the sheer weight of their bodies. I saw a trooper, a kid I knew from the Grox yards, firing his laser gun on full auto, screaming as they dragged him down. The sound of his scream cut off abruptly with a wet snap. There was no strategy here, no tactics. It was just biology winning over technology through brute force and numbers. I grabbed Lena's wrist so hard I felt her bones shift, and we ran. We ran past the burning bakery, past the overturned cars, past the neighbors who were too slow. "Don't look down," I shouted over and over. "Don't look at them, because if she looked at what was lying in the gutters, She would never move again. We were cutting through the alley behind the mechanics shop when one of them found us. It wasn't one of the big ones. It was a ripper, a scavenging organism the size of a large hound, but bloated with muscle and covered in slime. It erupted from a pile of trash, latching onto Lena's leg with jaws that looked like a hydraulic clamp. She didn't even scream. The shock stole her voice. She just fell eyes wide, scrabbling at the dirt. Panic cold and white hot flooded my veins. I didn't think. I didn't plan. I swung the heavy wrench I was still clutching in my right hand. I brought it down with every ounce of terror I had. Crunch. The sound was disgusting, wet and hollow, like smashing a melon wrapped in leather. I hit it again. And again. And again. I didn't stop until the thing was a smear of purple paste and twitching limbs. I stood there panting, covered in alien fluids that burned my skin. It was the first time I had ever killed anything more complex than a pest beetle. I expected to feel sick. I expected to feel horror. But all I felt was a dark, buzzing satisfaction. It was me or it, I thought. And it wasn't me. The transport. Lena pointed her voice a croak. At the end of the block, a heavy troop transport, an armored chimera, was rumbling toward the gate, its tracks churning up the asphalt. It was the last evac vehicle. The rear ramp was half-open hands, reaching out to pull stragglers inside. "Wait!" I screamed, waving my blood-slicked wrench. We sprinted toward it, lungs burning, legs pumping like pistons. We were 50 meters away. 40. I could see the face of the driver pale and terrified behind the thick glass. We were going to make it. Hope is a cruel thing. It makes you run faster just so you hit the wall harder. A roar shook the ground deep enough to rattle my teeth. From the side street, a living tank plowed through a brick wall. A Carnifex. It was a mountain of chitin and rage, screaming like a steam engine. It didn't even slow down. It rammed the side of the transport with the force of a meteor. The Chimera, 30 tons of armored steel, flipped into the air like a toy. It crashed upside-down tracks, spinning uselessly fuel tank, rupturing in a blossom of orange fire. The screams from inside lasted only a second before the heat silenced them. The blast wave knocked us off our feet, throwing us into a drainage ditch. I lay there, mud and ash filling my mouth, watching the monster tear the burning metal of the transport apart with its claws, looking for the meat inside. We didn't move. We didn't breathe. We lay in the filth, covered in the blood of the enemy, and watched our salvation burn. We were alone. The breach was complete. The heavy iron lid of the maintenance hatch slammed shut above us, sealing away the fire and the screams. The silence that followed was abrupt and violent. One moment, the world was ending in a cacophony of explosions and roaring monsters. The next, there was only the sound of our own ragged breathing and the dripping of water. We were in the storm drains, the arterial veins of the city's waste disposal system. It smelled of old copper rot and the chemical tang of water treatment agents. I fumbled for my mag light, clicking it on. The beam cut through the thick, humid air, illuminating the terrified faces of 5 strangers huddled in the muck. We were rats now. We had scurried into the walls, while the exterminators fumigated the house. I looked at Lena. She was shivering, covered in soot, and the dried blood of the ripper I'd killed. She didn't look at me. She was staring up at the ceiling, at the concrete that separated us from the sky. We all knew what was happening up there. The sky wasn't just dark, it was consumed. The hive fleet had blocked out the stars, the suns, everything. We were trapped in a box, and the lid had been nailed down. "Follow me," I whispered. My voice sounded too loud in the confined space, echoing off the wet brickwork. I know these tunnels. They connect to the hydroponics filtration plant near the spaceport. I wasn't brave. I was just the only one who knew the map. The others followed without question. they were broken people, a woman clutching a scorched picture frame, a man in a torn PDF uniform, a mechanic nursing a broken arm. We moved in single file, wading through knee-deep water that was uncomfortably warm. The tunnels were narrow, pressing in on us. I've always hated small spaces. The weight of the earth above me felt like a physical hand pressing down on my skull, trying to crush me. Every time my shoulder brushed against the slimy wall, I flinched, imagining claws reaching out from the masonry. Claustrophobia is a cold panic, a tightening of the throat that makes you want to scream just to prove you still have air. But I couldn't scream. Sound travels in pipes. If we screamed, they would hear us. We walked for what felt like hours, though my chrono was broken. Time had dissolved into a loop of footsteps and dripping water. Above us, muffled thuds vibrated through the ceiling, the footsteps of titans walking on our streets. Dust drifted down from the cracks, coating us in a gray shroud. "Stop," the soldier hissed suddenly. We froze. "Listen." At first I heard nothing. Then I heard it. A scratching sound. Not from above, but from the walls around us. It was the sound of something navigating the pipes, something with too many legs. "Lights off," I ordered. We plunged into absolute darkness. The blindness was total. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. We stood there, holding our breath, while the scratching grew louder, passed directly over our heads in a ventilation shaft, and then faded into the distance. I realized then that we weren't invading their territory. We were food, moving through a digestive tract. We stopped to rest in a junction room where the tunnels widened. The mechanic, a man named Jory, was groaning softly. "My side," he gasped. I think I got hit by shrapnel back there." I turned the light on him, shielding the beam with my hand. He had pulled up his shirt. There was a wound on his ribs, but it wasn't shrapnel. It was a puncture mark, perfectly round, surrounded by veins that had turned a vibrant, pulsing purple. It looked like a bruise that was alive. The flesh around it was moving, rippling, as if something was swimming just beneath the skin. I backed away, the bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a battle injury. This was the kiss. The Genostealers had been here for generations, infecting the bloodline, waiting for the fleet to arrive. The psychic call of the hive mind had triggered the dormant biology. "Jory!" I said, my voice trembling. "Stay back." He looked up at me, and for a second he was still human. He looked scared. "Help me," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back. The iris dissolved, swallowed by the pupil until his eyes were entirely black. His jaw unhinged with a wet crack, opening wider than a human mouth should. He didn't scream. He hissed. The woman next to him didn't have time to react. Jory lunged his fingers, elongating the nails, hardening into claws in real time. He tore into her throat with a savagery that was purely animal. The darkness erupted into chaos. I grabbed Lena, kicking Jory, or the thing that used to be Jory, in the face. It felt like kicking wet cement. "Run," I shouted. We abandoned them. We left the woman screaming in the dark. It wasn't mercy. It was math. 2 lives against a monster. As we sprinted down the tunnel, the screams behind us cut off, abruptly replaced by the wet sound of tearing meat. The infection wasn't just outside. It was in the room with us. We stumbled into the main pump station, a space so vast it felt like an industrial cathedral buried in the dark. The ceiling was lost in a haze of condensation, and the air was thick with the smell of recycled water and ozone. Massive turbines, silent, now stood like dormant gods in the gloom, their metal flanks slick with moisture. I dragged Lena behind a cluster of pipes, my lungs burning, as if I'd inhaled broken glass. The chaos of the tunnels was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt heavy, curated. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of a held breath. I scanned the room with my light, the beam catching only drifting steam and dripping chains. But I knew we weren't alone. I could feel it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up a primal warning system screaming that a predator was in the room. This wasn't the mindless hunger of the swarm we'd seen outside. This was focused. This was personal. "Stay down," I breathed the words, barely audible. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Lena pressed her face into my coat, trembling. I gripped my wrench, my knuckles white. Then I heard it. A clicking sound. It came from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the curved metal walls. It sounded like dry leaves rubbing together, or mandibles testing the air. I swung the light wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty walkways and the black water in the cistern below. Then, a drop of water fell on my hand. It was warm. I looked up. High above us, clinging to a vertical pipe, the air was shimmering. It looked like a heat haze, a distortion in the visual field. As I watched, two glowing yellow eyes materialized out of the nothingness, narrowing as they locked onto us. It wasn't hiding anymore. It was savoring the moment. The lictor dropped. It didn't fall. It flowed down the machinery like spilled oil, silent and fluid. It landed on the walkway 20 meters away, its camouflage skin rippling as it tried to match the rusted floor plates. It was huge, taller than a man, with feeder tendrils twitching around a maw filled with needle teeth. It didn't rush us. It stalked one scything talon, placing carefully in front of the other. It knew we had nowhere to go. I looked around, desperate. I was an engineer, not a soldier. I couldn't fight this thing. But I knew this station. I knew the pressure tolerances. I looked at the main release valve on the pipe running along the wall next to us. The gauge was in the red. The pressure hadn't been vented since the attack started. The pipe was singing with contained energy. "Cover your face," I yelled at Lena, shoving her down behind the thick steel of the turbine housing. The lictor lunged, a blur of motion, its talons raised to decapitate me. I didn't swing at the monster. I swung at the valve. The wrench connected with the rusted iron wheel with a jarring clang. The metal sheared. The valve blew. A jet of superheated steam, pressurized to 1,000 psi, erupted from the pipe with the scream of a banshee. It wasn't just hot, it was flaying. The blast hit the lictor square in the chest, instantly boiling the fluid in its carapace. The creature shrieked a sound that wasn't of this world, a high-pitched vibration that made my vision blur. The steam stripped away its camouflage, revealing the wet, purple flesh beneath as it thrashed blindly, clawing at the air. I didn't wait to see if it died. I grabbed Lena, and we ran through the blinding white fog, the heat blistering my skin. The creature was still screaming behind us, thrashing against the metal, but the sound was fading. We scrambled up the emergency maintenance ladder, my boots slipping on the wet rungs, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. We burst through the surface hatch and rolled onto the gravel of the exterior wasteland. The air outside was cool compared to the steam, but it was choked with ash. We were alive. We had escaped the dark, but as I looked up, I realized the victory was hollow. The lictor was a nightmare, yes, but what was waiting for us above ground was the apocalypse. The world we stepped into wasn't the one we had left. In the few hours we had been underground, the planet had been rewritten. The golden wheat fields of Sector 9 were gone. In their place stretched a gray, desolate slurry of dissolved organic matter, a flat ocean of sludge that stank of digestion. But it was the skyline that stopped my heart. Rising into the bruised clouds were the capillary towers, massive spiraling pillars of flesh and bone that pulsed with a rhythmic wet throb. They were miles high, swaying gently like reeds in a current, tethering the planet to the hive ships in orbit. I could hear them. a low, bass-heavy moan that vibrated in the soles of my boots. It was the sound of the planet being sucked dry through a straw. The air was thick with yellow spores, a choking fog that tasted of metal and sulfur. I pulled the rebreather mask tighter over Lena's face. "Don't breathe," I told her. "Don't take a single breath of this air that isn't filtered." She didn't nod. She just stared at the towers, her eyes reflecting the sick, bioluminescent pulse of the alien structures. We began to walk. There was no road anymore, just the direction where the hive city used to be. The ground was soft, spongy. It felt like walking on lung tissue. Every step released a puff of foul gas. We passed what used to be the evacuation checkpoint. Now, it was a graveyard. But it wasn't a battlefield. A battlefield implies a fight. This was a harvest. The bodies of the PDF troopers were piled in neat, grotesque mounds, stripped of their armor and weapons. I looked down and saw a face I recognized. It was Kale the miner from the clinic. His chest was open, ribs splayed like wings, the cavity empty. I stopped. I waited for the grief to hit me. I waited for the horror to make me vomit. But nothing came. I just looked at him and calculated the distance to the horizon. He wasn't Kale anymore. He was biomass. He was a resource waiting to be reclaimed. I stepped over him. I stepped over my neighbor, and I didn't even say a prayer. That was the moment the old Elias died. The engineer was gone. Only the survivor was left. In the middle of that gray wasteland, we found a ghost of the old world. A chimera armored transport sat half buried in a crater of mud. Its turret was twisted. The barrel of the multi-laser bent like a broken finger, but the chassis looked intact. It was a beautiful, ugly block of Imperial steel. I ran to it, sliding down the crater wall. The hatch was jammed. I used my wrench, hammering at the locking mechanism with a frantic, rhythmic clang that echoed too loudly in the quiet. Clang, clang, crack. The seal broke. I pulled the hatch open. Inside, the crew was dead, slumped over the controls, but the console lights were still flickering, weak amber. I shoved the driver's body aside. It was just meat, just an obstacle, and slid into the seat. "Get in!" I yelled to Lena. She scrambled into the troop compartment, curling into a ball on the metal bench. I hotwired the ignition. The machine groaned. It coughed, spat black smoke, and then, with a roar that shook the frame, the engine caught. The vibration of the engine was the sweetest thing I had ever felt. It was power. It was human defiance. But as the roar of the diesel motor cut through the alien atmosphere, the sky answered. The yellow fog above us swirled. High-pitched shrieks pierced the low moan of the towers. I looked through the periscope. They were coming down from the clouds, gargoyles. Leathery wings, venomous tails. Faces that were frozen in a permanent shriek. Hundreds of them. The engine noise hadn't been a victory cry. It was a dinner bell. I slammed the transmission into gear, and the Chimera lurched forward, tracks churning the flesh mud. We weren't fighting. We were running, and the sky was falling to catch us. The inside of the Chimera was a drum, and the world outside was beating on it with 1,000 hammers. The gargoyles weren't just attacking. They were throwing themselves against the hull in a suicidal frenzy. I could hear the wet, heavy thuds of their bodies impacting the armor, followed by the screech of acid eating into the paint. The periscope was useless, smeared with slime and gore, so I was driving blind, relying on the cogitator's tactical display, which was flickering with dying amber light. Beneath us, the tracks weren't grinding on stone or asphalt. They were squelching. We were driving over a living carpet of rippers, millions of ankle-high horrors that had flooded the plains to consume what the larger beasts left behind. Every vibration of the chassis, every sickening crunch transmitted through the steering yoke, told me I was crushing living things. A day ago, the thought would have paralyzed me. I would have vomited. Now I just gripped the levers tighter and prayed the tracks wouldn't jam with the sheer volume of meat we were churning through. Then the Voxcaster woke up. It had been hissing with the white noise of the shadow in the warp for days, a psychic scream that drowned out all technology. But suddenly, a spike of clarity pierced the static. It wasn't a clear signal. It was ragged, distorted by the atmospheric interference. But it was a voice. A human voice. "This is Thunderhawk gunship Valor's End. Inbound for extraction. Pattern Delta. High port Gamma. Surviving personnel. Immediate dust-off." The voice was deep gravelly and completely devoid of fear. It was the voice of an Astartes, a space marine. It sounded like a god speaking from a mountaintop. I stared at the radio, as if it were a holy relic. The interference washed back over the signal, a second later drowning it in shrieks. But I had heard enough. High port Gamma, the spaceport at the top of the hive. "Did you hear that?" I yelled over the roar of the engine, my voice cracking with a hysteria I couldn't suppress. I looked back at Lena. She was curled into a ball on the troop bench, her hands clamped over her ears to shut out the sound of the monster scratching at the roof. She looked up, her eyes dull and glassy. "They're coming for us," I promised her. It was a lie, or maybe half a truth. They weren't coming for us. They were coming for the high-value targets, the planetary governor, the generals. We were just dust on their boots. But if we could get to that landing zone, if we could just be in the shadow of their wings, maybe we could slip through. I didn't tell her that. I just told her the part that would keep her breathing. I slammed the throttle levers forward, bypassing the safety limiters on the engine. The Chimera bucked the diesel turbine, screaming as it redlined. The heat in the cabin spiked the smell of burning oil, mixing with the reek of ozone. I drove like a madman. I drove over the ruins of farmhouses, through the wreckage of convoys that hadn't made it. I didn't go around obstacles. I went through them. The hope the signal gave me was dangerous. It was a drug. It made me reckless. I stopped checking the fuel gauge. I stopped checking the integrity of the armor. I just focused on that single coordinate, that single point of light in the darkness. We crested the final ridge, and the hive city came into view. It was a nightmare of Gothic architecture, a mountain of steel and stone that pierced the clouds. But it wasn't the majestic spire I remembered. It was burning. Great plumes of black smoke poured from the lower levels, and the upper spires were wreathed in the purple lightning of the Tyranid bioships descending from orbit. The city looked like a rotting tooth, infected and dying. But at the very summit, tiny specks of silver light were moving gunships. They were real. The signal wasn't a ghost. It was a lighthouse, but it was guiding us straight into the heart of the fire. The Chimera didn't die with a bang. It died with a shudder. The engine coughed once, a wet, metallic sound, and then the tracks locked up, throwing us forward against the dashboard. Silence flooded back in, but it wasn't the silence of the void. It was the roar of a city burning to death. We scrambled out of the hatch, coughing in the thick, oily smoke. The outskirts of the hive city were a labyrinth of shattered bunkers and trenches that had been dug only days ago. Now they were graves. The ground here wasn't mud anymore. It was a slurry of pulverized concrete, spent shell casings, and ash. The heat was immense. It radiated from the burning hab blocks above, creating a thermal updraft that carried the smell of roasting meat, human and xenos alike, high into the air. It was a smell you could taste, greasy and sweet on the tongue. I grabbed Lena's hand. Her grip was weak. She was fading the shock, shutting her down system by system. "Walk," I told her. "Just walk." We moved into the trench line, heads down. The noise was physically painful. Artillery batteries from the upper spires were firing rhythmically, a constant thump, thump, thump that shook the fluid in my ears. We passed the remnants of the Planetary Defense Force. They weren't an army anymore. They were ghosts, covered in gray dust. Men with bandaged eyes sat against the trench walls, too tired to scream. Women were frantically reloading las packs with bleeding fingers, their eyes fixed on the smoke-filled horizon. Nobody looked at us. We were civilians, dead weight, just more biomass for the enemy. A Vox officer was screaming into a handset nearby, his voice cracking. "Sector 4 is gone, I repeat. The wall is breached. Send support." The only answer was the static hiss of the hive mind. He threw the handset down and put his head in his hands. It wasn't a retreat. It was a collapse. An old sergeant leaned against a sandbag wall, smoking a low stick that was burned down to the filter. He watched us approach with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. He didn't have a helmet. Half his face was burned, the skin shiny and taut. He looked at Lena, then at me. He didn't offer help. He didn't offer a way out. He reached into his webbing and pulled out a heavy auto pistol, a solid, ugly slug thrower. He held it out to me, butt first. "Take it," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. I hesitated. "I don't know how to shoot," I said. He laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. "You don't aim at them, boy," he said, pressing the cold steel into my palm. "The armor on those bugs is too thick. This is for her. And then for you." He gestured with his chin toward Lena. "Don't let them take you alive. That's the only victory you get today." I took the gun. It was heavy, greasy with oil. I looked at it, then shoved it into my belt. I wanted to throw it away, but I knew he was right. It wasn't a weapon. It was an exit strategy. Suddenly the ground jumped. A sound like the earth cracking open tore through the air. The main defensive wall 100 meters ahead of us exploded inward. Dust and debris showered down like rain. Through the smoke, a silhouette emerged, massive, horned, unstoppable. A carnifex. It roared a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated the ribcage. The trench erupted into panic. Las fire flashed bright and desperate. "Run!" I screamed, turning to grab Lena. But the shockwave of a second explosion threw me sideways. I hit the trench wall hard, darkness flashing across my vision. When I looked up, the world was dust, and Lena's hand was gone from mine. I found her in the shadow of the freight elevator, curled into a ball beneath a stack of shipping containers. The air here was vibrating not with sound, but with the sheer displacement of the mag-lev trains launching overhead. It was the loading dock for the stars, a vast labyrinth of steel canyons and hydraulic lifts. Lena was covered in gray dust, looking like a statue left out in the rain. I reached for her, my hands shaking so hard I could barely close my fingers. "I'm here," I choked out. "I'm here." I pulled her up, checking her for blood for breaks. She was whole, but her eyes were vacant. She was retreating inside herself, going to a place where the monsters couldn't reach. I couldn't blame her. I wanted to go there too. But the ramp to the last transport was only 200 meters away. I could see the amber warning lights flashing. I could see the heat haze from the thrusters. We were so close. Then the shadow fell over us. It didn't creep up. It simply blocked out the burning sky. I turned slowly. Standing between us and the ship was a Tyranid warrior. This wasn't a mindless animal like the Gaunts. This was a soldier. It stood 8 feet tall, armored in interlocking plates of chitin that looked like ancient polished bone. It held a bio-cannon in its upper limbs and a pair of serrated swords in the lower ones. It didn't scream. It didn't charge. It tilted its head, the compound eyes examining us with a cold, alien intelligence. It was assessing threat levels. It was calculating biomass. I reached for the pistol the sergeant had given me, but my hand froze. The old soldier was right. Against this, that gun was a toy. This thing was a tank made of meat. It took a step forward, the heavy hoof cracking the concrete floor. It hissed a sound like steam escaping a vent. It knew it had won. But I wasn't a soldier. I was a technician. I spent 10 years servicing this dock. I knew every bolt, every valve, every conduit. I looked past the monster at the wall behind it. There was a yellow pipe running vertically along the stanchion, a high-pressure hydraulic line for the heavy lifters. 7,000 psi of fluid. I looked at the warrior, then at the pipe, then at the heavy wrench still gripped in my left hand. It was a suicide play. But standing there was death anyway. "Run for the ramp," I whispered to Lena. She didn't move. When I move, I snarled, pushing her. "You run," I stepped away from her, waving my arms. "Over here, you ugly bastard! Look at me!" The warrior's head snapped toward me. It took the bait. It raised its bio-cannon, the muscle sacks along the barrel contracting to fire. I didn't run at it. I threw the wrench. Not at the monster, but past it. The heavy steel tool spun through the air and smashed into the release coupling of the yellow pipe. The metal sheared. The result was instantaneous and violent. The hydraulic line whipped loose like a severed artery of the world. A jet of pressurized fluid moving fast enough to cut. Diamond erupted into the space. The hose thrashed wildly, striking the warrior in the back. The impact sounded like a thunderclap. The fluid blasted through the chitin armor, shredding the biological mesh underneath. The creature shrieked a sound of genuine pain and spun around, slashing at the mechanical snake attacking it. The hose whipped again, catching it in the head, shattering one of its bone swords. It was chaos. It was industrial physics versus alien biology. Go, I grabbed Lena and we sprinted. Behind us, the warrior was flailing, pinned against the containers by the relentless pressure of the spray. I didn't look back to see if it died. I heard the wet tearing of flesh and the clang of metal, and that was enough. We hit the ramp of the transport just as the hydraulics began to whine, lifting the heavy door. A crewman at the top face, masked in a rebreather, saw us. He waved frantically. Jump, we were 10 feet away. The gap was widening. I threw Lena forward. The crewman caught her arm. I jumped a second later, my chest slamming into the cold metal of the deck. Hands grabbed my jacket, hauling me inside. As the door sealed with a pressurized hiss, I lay on the floor, gasping for air that smelled of recycled sweat and fear. I looked at my hands. They were empty. I had left the wrench behind. My tool. My weapon. My badge of office. I was just a man now. The floor of the cargo hold wasn't solid ground anymore. It was a vibrating plate of steel that threatened to shake the teeth out of our skulls. We were packed in tight shoulder to shoulder, a mass of refugees, smelling of sweat, urine, and unwashed terror. There were no seats, no safety harnesses. We just grabbed onto cargo netting pipes or each other. When the main thrusters fired, gravity doubled. I fell to my knees, dragging Lena down with me, shielding her body with mine, as the ship lurched upward. It wasn't a smooth flight. We weren't cutting through air. We were punching through a solid wall of biomass. I could hear them hitting the hull. Thud, thud, crunch. It sounded like we were flying through a hailstorm of stones. But I knew it wasn't stones. It was the gargoyles. It was the spore mines. We were forcing our way up the throat of the beast, and it was trying to swallow us back down. The lights in the hold flickered and died, replaced by the spinning crimson of emergency strobes. In the flashing red dark, I saw faces distorted by G-force and panic. A woman was praying loudly, her voice, a jagged shriek over the roar of the engines. A child was crying, but the sound was swallowed by the vibration. Then the world tilted. A massive impact rocked the starboard side. The sound was deafening, the screech of metal being torn apart like wet paper. A spore mine had detonated against the flank. The hull integrity warning screamed a high-pitched electronic wail that pierced the brain. A section of the wall 10 meters away from us buckled and peeled back. The air didn't just leave the room, it was violently ripped out. A sudden freezing wind howled through the breach, carrying with it loose debris crates and people. I saw a man, the one who had been praying, get lifted off his feet. He didn't have time to scream. He was just sucked out into the stratosphere, vanishing into the toxic yellow clouds swirling outside. The suction was a physical weight, dragging us toward the hole. "Hold on!" I roared, locking my arm around a heavy support stanchion. I grabbed Lena by the waist, burying my face in her shoulder to keep the air in my lungs. My boots scrambled on the deck plates, finding no purchase. The cold was instantaneous. It froze the sweat on my skin and turned my breath into ice crystals. I felt my grip slipping. The metal was slick with condensation. I looked at the hole, a jagged maw, revealing a sky that was burning purple. I was going to die. I was going to slip, and we were both going to fall forever. Then a hand grabbed my collar. It was a thick, calloused hand stained with grease. I looked up. It was a docker, a massive woman with a rebreather mask. She had lashed herself to the cargo netting with a cable. She didn't speak. She just held me. Then another hand grabbed my belt. Then another. We formed a human chain, a web of muscle and desperation anchoring each other against the void. For a moment, amidst the chaos of a dying world, we were a single organism. We weren't refugees fighting for a seat. We were cells in a body refusing to die. The emergency bulkhead slammed down a second later, sealing the breach with a heavy metallic clang. The howling wind stopped. The pressure stabilized. We fell to the floor, a tangle of limbs and gasping lungs. The docker released me and nodded once. It wasn't a gesture of friendship. It was just an acknowledgement. We are still here. The vibration changed. The roar of the atmospheric thrusters died down, replaced by the smooth, high-pitched hum of the vacuum drives. The crushing weight of gravity lifted. We were floating just for a second before the artificial gravity plates kicked in. I stood up, my legs shaking, and moved to the small, reinforced viewport near the airlock. I wanted to see. I needed to see. I wiped the frost from the thick glass and looked out. We had broken through the cloud layer. The sky was black, sprinkled with the cold, indifferent light of distant stars. But below us was the end of everything. The planet was no longer a blue and green marble. It was a pulsating sore. Purple tendrils of biomatter wrapped around the continents like a cancer. And hanging in the void above it, blotting out the starlight, were the hive ships. They were immense organic leviathans drifting silently in the dark. We were tiny. We were specks of dust floating past a whale. The rescue didn't come from the ground. It came from the void, and it didn't look like mercy. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the viewport, I watched the Imperial Navy arrive. They weren't white knights riding in to save the princess. They were gray, monolithic slabs of Gothic steel battleships the size of cities, bristling with macro cannons and lance batteries. They moved with a glacial, terrifying indifference, plowing through the cloud of Tyranid bioships, like sharks moving through a school of krill. They weren't engaging in a dogfight. They were forming a blockade, a cordon. I realized then, with a cold clarity that settled in my stomach, like a stone, that they hadn't come to save Aegis IV. They had come to euthanize it. We were the lucky few who had slipped out of the quarantine zone before the doors locked. For everyone else down there, for the neighbors, for Dr. Eris, for the old sergeant in the trench, the time for running was over. The comms on the transport deck crackled to life, overriding the static. It was a broadcast on all frequencies, a voice even deeper and colder than the Space Marines had been. Planet Aegis IV is designated Perdita. The taint is absolute. By the authority of the Holy Inquisition, Exterminatus is authorized. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. I didn't look away. I couldn't. I watched as the belly of the lead battleship opened. It didn't fire a laser. It didn't launch a swarm of missiles. It dropped a single object. a cyclonic torpedo. It fell slowly, tumbling end over end, a tiny speck of metal descending toward the swirling purple clouds of the planet below. It looked harmless. It looked like a needle falling into a haystack. When it hit the atmosphere, there was no sound. Space is the ultimate silencer. There was just a flash, a blinding white light that seared the retinas and washed out the stars. It started at the impact point and spread outward, a ring of fire moving faster than the eye could follow. It wasn't an explosion, it was an ignition. The atmosphere itself caught fire. The clouds burned away in seconds. The oceans boiled into steam instantly. The continents cracked. I saw the tectonic plates buckle and shatter, revealing the molten core of the world beneath. The planet didn't die peacefully. It convulsed. It was torn apart from the inside out. I watched my home, the fields I had tended, the cities I had known, the graves of my parents, all reduced to a smear of expanding dust and magma. It took less than a minute. 10,000 years of history erased because the math said it was necessary. The silence in the cargo hold was absolute. No one prayed. No one cried. What we were seeing was too big for tears. It was a tragedy on a scale that the human mind couldn't process, so it just shut down. We were statues, frozen in the amber of our own trauma. I felt a tug on my sleeve. I looked down. Lena was looking at me. Her face was washed in the pale light of the dying world reflected through the glass. Her eyes were clear, the panic gone, replaced by a terrifying emptiness. She opened her mouth, her lips dry and cracked. "Gone," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken in years. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. She looked at the burning cinder below, then up at me. "Where do we go?" I looked at the void beyond the burning planet. It was black, cold, and infinite. The hive fleet was already turning, moving away from the dead rock, looking for the next meal. The war wasn't over. It had just moved. We were refugees now, drifting in the dark, carried by a ship that didn't care about us toward a destination we didn't know. I wasn't an engineer anymore. I wasn't a citizen. I was just a unit of biomass that had refused to be eaten. I put my arm around Lena, pulling her head onto my shoulder so she wouldn't have to watch the debris field drifting past. The wrench was gone. The home was gone. But I could feel her heartbeat against my side, steady and strong. "I don't know," I said, and my voice was calm. "Forward. We go forward." I turned my back on the window. I sat down on the cold deck plating and closed my eyes. The image of the burning world was burned into my eyelids, but I didn't try to blink it away. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the breathing of the survivors. We were alive. That would have to be enough. In the 41st millennium, there are no happy endings, only delayed executions. If you had to choose between facing the Tyranid swarm or the Inquisition's exterminatus, which way do you go out? Tell me in the comments. And if you survived this story, leave a like to keep the Voxcaster running.